Good evening, you're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Dahmen. America says it's boarded a Russian-flagged oil tanker linked to Venezuela and sanctioned as part of the Kremlin's shadow fleet. The seizure in the North Atlantic threatening a standoff tonight between Washington and Moscow. More in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Marco Rubio says he will meet with Danish officials over Greenland next week. Protests ramp up in Iran in the face of a collapsing economy. And Berlin's longest blackout since World War II comes to an end. But we begin tonight with the American capture of an oil tanker flying the Russian flag in the North Atlantic. After weeks of pursuing the ship as part of Washington's efforts to block Venezuelan oil exports, US forces moved in this afternoon, taking over the tanker first registered in Panama, Guyana and then Russia. Sonia Gatabischan reports.
Washington and Moscow have found themselves in a standoff in the Atlantic. On Wednesday, the U.S. European Command announced the seizure of an oil tanker, with U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth adding,
"The blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world."
The ship has undergone a significant transformation in recent days, changing its name from Bella 1 to Marinera, as well as the flag it was flying. Officially first registered under Panama, then flying a false Guyana flag, the tanker was seized under Russian colors. The vessel was last reported to be sailing empty, but international attention suggests there may be more to the story.
Probably the U.S. authorities, they do have their internal information about what actually the vessel is carrying. So we can talk either about weapons, we can talk about narcotics, we can talk about main stuff over here, since actually they have spent a lot of time and effort in order to come on board on the vessel.
In December, Donald Trump ordered a blockade of sanctioned vessels to and from Venezuela. At the time, the U.S. Coast Guard attempted to board this oil tanker in the Caribbean when it was suspected of approaching Venezuela. But then the ship took a dramatic turn, ending up near Iceland on Tuesday.
Since the vessel officially was not loaded with any cargo, the only thing that we can imagine is that the vessel was carrying something that the Russians don't want to be presented.
And Marinera was not the only ship seized by the United States on Wednesday, as the U.S. Coast Guard also intercepted a Venezuela-linked supertanker M. Sofia in Caribbean waters. The developments take place after the U.S. captured Venezuela's former leader Nicolás Maduro on Saturday. Against this backdrop, comments made in 2019 by Fiona Hill, former advisor to Donald Trump, resurfaced, with the official implying that Russia was willing to withdraw its support for Maduro, letting U.S. act as it wished in Venezuela in exchange for a free hand in Ukraine. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabischan.
Moving to Ukraine now, and President Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff says security guarantees for Kyiv are on the final stretch as France and the United Kingdom formally indicate they're ready to deploy troops once a peace deal is struck. That appears to leave the ball in the court of Russia's Vladimir Putin, who's telling his country's children that their warriors are carrying out a holy mission. Kazimierz Szwysiek has more.
This is a school in eastern Ukraine, its windows shattered from another Russian drone strike. The attack came a day after Orthodox Christmas, leaving Ukrainians disillusioned about the prospect of peace.
As long as Putin is alive, there will be no peace agreements.
And the Russian leader is giving no indications that he is willing to talk peace. War was the main point of his Christmas message to children.
At all times in Russia, this is how people have regarded our warriors, as those who, as if by the Lord's command, carry out the holy mission of defending the fatherland.
These comments coinciding with the United Kingdom and France signing a declaration of intent to put troops on the ground in Ukraine after a ceasefire.
This is a vital part of our ironcast commitment to stand with Ukraine for the long term. It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas and regenerating Ukraine's armed forces for the future.
And while the US says security guarantees for Ukraine are on their final stretch,
we think we're largely finished with security protocols, which are important so that the people of Ukraine know that when this ends, it ends forever.
Russia has recently kept it quiet when it comes to the peace process, letting its drones and missiles do the talking. The warm messaging between Washington and Moscow from last year is so far nowhere to be seen either.
Putin has to understand that the Ukrainians will continue to fight and defend themselves. He now understands that the Europeans are ready to put troops on the ground and other ways to provide the support to Ukraine for its security. Putin now understands that the Americans are backing that.
Speaking exclusively to TVP World, former US Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor had some advice for President Donald Trump on how to achieve peace.
If you want to end it, the way to do it is to put pressure on Putin. And you, Mr. President, you, President Trump, have the leverage, the capability to put pressure on Putin, probably like no one else. Don't shake his hand. What you should do is put pressure on him in terms of military and in terms of economic.
And at least some pressure is on. The US announced on Tuesday it will more than triple its production of interceptor missiles for Patriot air defense batteries in 2026. Some of it will surely make its way to Ukraine, purchased for Kyiv by European partners. Still, President Volodymyr Zelensky would like to see even more pressure put on Russia.
I believe the Americans are currently working productively. We have good results, but the process has not yet been fully pushed through to the end. They must put pressure on Russia. They have the tools and they know how to use them. The key thing is for Ukraine to remain a priority for them.
The hope for Ukraine to remain a priority is shared especially by Ukrainian civilians, for whom this is a daily reality. For TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
And as Kyiv hopes to keep Washington's focus on Ukraine, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has revealed he will meet with Danish officials over Greenland next week. It comes after foreign ministers from the so-called Weimar Triangle sat down in Paris in the wake of Donald Trump's threats that the military could be used to take the island. For more, let's go live to the French capital, where our correspondent Alex Cadier is standing by. Good evening to you, Alex. How has President Trump's renewed push for Greenland been received in Paris?
Well, good evening, Aaron. We've seen a response from the French government, from other European powers, that was calm and firm. Calm in particular because they did not allow these threats, these comments made by the US president to sidetrack the very important coalition of willing peace talks where security guarantees were assured for Ukraine in the last 24 hours that you just heard about in Kazimierz Łysiak's report. Instead, trying to nip this in the bud with a joint statement from 8 European leaders, including President Macron, including Prime Minister Tusk, of course, saying that cooperation when it comes to security in the Arctic, including around Greenland, has to be done within NATO and has to respect the sovereignty of Greenland and Denmark. But firm at the same time, because we have seen some pushback from the French foreign minister, clearly making it very plain that European partners are now drawing up plans to respond to any such aggression in Greenland. He was, of course, meeting with Radosław Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, as well as their German counterpart. Those two men had this to say.
These intimidations must stop, and Denmark knows it can count on the solidarity of European countries, which reaffirmed this through their heads of state and governments in a joint statement no later than yesterday.
Perhaps what I would like to add is that matters of territory, war and peace in the United States constitutionally are in the power of the US Congress. I would like to know the position of the US Congress on Greenland.
So the Polish foreign minister there pointing out that actually annexing, buying, invading Greenland is not simply in the gift of Donald Trump or his Secretary of State Marco Rubio. That did not stop Marco Rubio then continuing to defend his boss, saying that he is not the first president to be interested in Greenland, pointing out that President Truman had also considered the option of acquiring Greenland in some way or another. Nevertheless, as Minister Sikorski pointed out, that is not a decision that can be made unilaterally by the US president. Something that is also worth being considered is that, of course, annexation, purchase, invasion, whatever the threats have been, is not the only way for the US to have its national security assured in Greenland. We heard that from Sir Robin Niblett speaking to my colleague Adam Yasser.
There is, as you know, the Pituffik space base in the northwest corner of Greenland, which is there precisely to track any missiles that might come over and be able to ensure that US missile defense capabilities could protect them. So there is one way of going about it, which is to say Greenland is essential to America's future security in a world where it may be competing with both Russia and China simultaneously, and that Greenland is a critical part of that infrastructure, as it was in the last Cold War against the Soviet Union. The question then becomes, do you need to own it? Do you have to own it?
Well, Denmark has said that that answer is no. They do not need to own it because, in part, the people of Greenland themselves recently elected a government whose position was very clearly not to join the United States. But there are other ways. Denmark has been cooperating with the United States on national security. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, will next week, as you mentioned, Aaron, be meeting with Danish counterparts. You can imagine that meeting may be rather tense, Aaron.
Alex Cartier in Paris, thank you very much. And we'll break all of this down with Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland, later on World News Tonight. Mass demonstrations sparked by Iran's collapsing economy are spreading across the Middle Eastern country, just days after President Trump warned that America will step in if any more protesters are killed. As Piotr Mistruk explains, more than 30 people have already died at the hands of the regime, with reports now emerging that Iran's supreme leader could escape to Russia.
The situation in Iran is flaring up. Over the course of 10-day countrywide anti-regime protests, at least 36 people were killed and over 2,000 have been arrested, according to the foreign-based human rights activist news agency. The mass demonstrations were triggered by Iran's economic woes.
You wake up in the morning and everything is expensive. Dairy is expensive, the dollar is expensive.
But it seems to have escalated beyond just that. Experts say it's an unprecedented situation for Iran's theocratic Islamic regime and a harbinger of its downfall.
We're beginning to see indications that the army, which is extremely badly paid in Iran, is beginning to get into small confrontations with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is, as you know, the Praetorian Guard, the bodyguard of the Islamic regime. The reality is the theocratic regime is over. The only question is, when does it fall?
The Iranian protests prompted a reaction from US President Donald Trump.
If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
It's yet another warning for Iran. Last week, Trump cautioned Tehran against rebuilding the nuclear sites the US claims to have destroyed back in its June attacks.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down, we'll knock the hell out of them.
But what the Iranian regime might be truly afraid of is that they will follow in the footsteps of their close ally Venezuela, with whom they forged closer military ties and expanded oil trade in recent years. Iran's leaders seem to already have a contingency plan in place.
Ayatollah Khomeini, the spiritual and political leader of Iran, is considering to take refuge in Moscow in case of necessity.
An overthrow of Khamenei would pose a two-pronged problem for Russia, not only to its arsenal of Iran-made Shahed drones it uses against Ukraine, but also to its oil sales due to a potential lifting of sanctions on Iran's petroleum.
That would knock out some element of Russian support. One shouldn't overstate it, but it would certainly knock out some elements of Russian support. And of course, increasing energy supplies would undermine Russia's economy, which is incredibly energy-based.
But it would also usher in an era of even greater uncertainty, as it remains unknown how close Iran is to enriching its uranium deposits to weapons-grade levels. For TVP World, I'm Piotr Mistruk.
Berlin's longest blackout since World War II is over. Power has been restored to tens of thousands of homes caught up in Saturday's arson attack on high-voltage cables in the German capital. A left-wing activist group has claimed responsibility, with police opening a terror investigation into the suspected active sabotage. Our defence correspondent Susanna Jurek reports.
These are not refugees. These are Berliners seeking shelter from the cold of their own homes, as 45,000 households across the German capital have been left without electricity.
We have the most offers for help, and the people who come here now, and what they ask for is actually to charge their cell phones, to take a shower so they can go back to their apartments, and then we can get through the days.
I think every Berliner tries to help so that we can minimize the damage, and the city always sticks best together in times of disaster.
The power outages were caused by the arson attack carried out on January 3rd on high-voltage cables near the Lichterfelde heat and power station. Responsibility for the attack was immediately claimed by the extreme-left Volcano Group, who previously targeted power supplies of Tesla Gigafactory near Berlin. Berlin's mayor said the January 3rd attack is
not a minor arson attack, not sabotage, but a terrorist attack by a left-wing extremist organization.
This classification prompted questions about potential adversaries being involved, though the Volcano Group insists.
These speculations are nothing more than an attempt to conceal one's own powerlessness. The fact that people here on the ground are capable of attacking infrastructure does not fit into the security narrative of politicians and authorities. So, an external enemy is constructed. This is convenient, relieves pressure and shifts the debate.
But skepticism towards rogue agents acting alone is not unfounded. As early as 2014, the then NATO Secretary General floated the idea of Russian greenwashing in the West.
Russia, as part of their sophisticated information and disinformation operations, engage actively with so-called non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations working against shale gas.
Rasmussen's suggestions were corroborated 3 years later by US House representatives who alleged that Russia was encouraging groups of environmentalists to steer Western nations away from seeking energy sovereignty.
Other officials have indicated that the same scheme is unfolding in the US. These statements and related reports providing evidence that Russia is also behind radical statements and vitriol directed at the US fossil fuel sector.
This in itself is not a new phenomenon, however. As experts note, the history of Moscow propping up NGOs in the West dates back to the Cold War era.
They were used as part of this hybrid warfare in the sense that they were useful for instilling destabilization, instilling fear, the psychological effect into Western societies.
And as others suggest, the propping up of extreme groups also serves to complement other strategies of Russia's hybrid warfare against NATO and the EU.
Another one was this explosion on railroad in Poland, which could have resulted with hundreds of fatalities. So we are confronted with increasing methods of what is called a hybrid war.
But that's not to say that the West is entirely powerless when it comes to fighting Moscow's influence, particularly in the information sphere.
The education, not only how we should act if something happens, but also this education, this broader education that will serve de-radicalization of those groups that may be especially prone to radicalization.
For TVP World, Susanna Jurek.
And joining me now for an exclusive interview is Daniel Fried, former US Ambassador to Poland. Good evening, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening.
Let's start with this American seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic linked to Venezuela. Is this within Donald Trump's right, or has he crossed arguably another red line after the arrest of Nicolas Maduro?
Well, I'm not going to shed any tears for Maduro's departure, nor will I shed tears for a tanker which was started to fly the Russian flag in an attempt to evade U.S. action. There are other things the Trump administration is doing that are higher on my list of problems. The notion of going after Venezuela tankers and pushing back against the Russians is not on my short list of Trump administration objectionable actions.
There is a bit of a but, though, right? Because we're seeing the President of the United States, in some ways, in his drive towards Western Hemisphere dominance, rewrite the rules of international law, no?
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. The raid against Maduro in Venezuela can legitimately be questioned as a violation of international law. So could the invasion of Panama in 1989 by George H.W. Bush. That invasion was largely forgotten. I'll bet a week ago you weren't thinking about that. And that's because it was largely regarded as a success. I'm not suggesting that success obviates the need to respect international law. I am saying that when you succeed, you can claim a measure of vindication. We succeeded in Panama because there was a peaceful transition to a democratic government, and the person who was overthrown was a dictator. Now, in Venezuela, it is not clear how this comes out. The best scenario would be for the U.S. to support a transition to a democratically elected government, probably the opposition that arguably won the 2024 presidential elections. But the Trump administration has not chosen to follow this path, at least not yet. They seem to be working with the remnants of the Maduro regime, or rather the Maduro regime minus Maduro. This risks putting the U.S. on the wrong side of Venezuelan opinion if, in fact, the Venezuelans continue to support the democratic opposition, as they seem to, including Maria Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize and who is the leader of the democratic opposition. So I think this is a problem. The U.S. could succeed in Venezuela in a way similar to the way it succeeded in Panama, but to do that, we're going to have to not back an unpopular dictatorship, Maduro's regime without Maduro, and we need to get together with Venezuelan opposition, which represents a majority of society.
On this Russian-flagged oil tanker seized today, how does this play out for President Trump? Because he's historically had quite open ties with Vladimir Putin, especially over Ukraine. I mean, could this pit Washington against Moscow?
Well, it's interesting. Overshadowed by the events in Venezuela and the unconscionable U.S. threats to Greenland, there has been steady progress in fleshing out security framework for Ukraine. There was a meeting in Paris yesterday, including 2 senior U.S. representatives, close to Trump, both of them, at which progress was made. It's no longer as clear to me that Trump will keep indulging Vladimir Putin. That may no longer be the case. Putin tried to derail these security talks about Ukraine by rather ludicrously claiming that the U.S. had attacked one of Putin's palaces in one, near Valdai. Trump initially accepted Putin's word, which was a problem. But a few days later, Trump pushed back and said the attack probably never happened. This Russian effort was hasty and clumsy, suggesting that the Russians mounted it in haste. What were they worried about? I think they were worried about the talks about Ukrainian security that were making progress. Poland's been represented at those talks as well. So I think it is no longer a safe assumption that Trump will side with Putin. And I think the Russians might be becoming nervous about this. I'm not confident that the U.S. will end up backing Ukrainian security, but this is certainly a growing possibility, and I welcome it.
You mentioned Greenland. As we go to air tonight, we're hearing that Marco Rubio will meet with Danish officials next week to talk about Greenland. He also says Donald Trump wants to buy the island. Is this all about pressuring Copenhagen into a business deal, Mr. Ambassador? And why does America need to own the islands to deliver security?
Well, the United States does not need to annex Greenland. There is no good reason for threatening our Danish ally and threatening Greenland. All of our security concerns can better be met by working within the 1951 U.S.-Danish Treaty on the Defense of Greenland, which provides the U.S. with rather open-ended basing rights. We could probably get the Danes to help pay for additional U.S. bases if that's what we decided to do. There is no U.S. interest that cannot better be served by working with rather than against Denmark. This threatened aggression against Denmark and Greenland serves no discernible purpose I can see.
Is there a danger now, after this relative success of the attack on Venezuela, that Commander-in-Chief Trump feels this kind of ease of military success, that his appetite for risk grows, and that he ultimately launches into Greenland, boots and all, simply because he can?
I wish I could tell you that you are completely wrong, but this danger does exist. I think the Danish government called on its European allies to push back, and the result was the statement issued the other day by major European governments, including the government of Italy, which is politically aligned with Trump. I think that the more Europe pushes back in a judicious way, but clearly, so that Trump knows this will not be accepted easily by Europe, the chances of him actually acting in an aggressive fashion drop. However, this is not a happy place to be. It is frankly dishonorable. Greenland has done nothing to warrant this. Denmark has been a stalwart ally of the United States. There is no defense I can make for such behavior, and I'm not going to do it. For Venezuela, there is at least a case, and frankly, I'm not going to shed any tears about Maduro's departure. You can make a case for what the Americans have done. I cannot make any reasonable case for threatening Denmark and Greenland.
To be clear, if the president uses force to take over Greenland, that's the end of the NATO alliance, right?
Well, I don't know what the implications would be. It would be a body blow to transatlantic solidarity. It would mean that the United States was behaving as one of the aggressor nations that we used to oppose. Our old enemies from the 20th century behaved in an aggressive fashion. It is disgraceful to see the United States considering doing the same. So I don't like that at all. And I think that Europe is well advised to keep sending the signals to Trump that we cannot get away with anything like this cost-free.
We're running out of time, but I very briefly want to ask you about the Nordics, Baltics, the likes of Poland and all of this, because do you expect those countries so closely positioned geographically between Russia and the West soon to face this defining choice, either be loyal to Washington or be loyal to your own European allies?
It's a choice that Poland should not be forced to make. You've asked a fair question. There is no comfortable answer. And I think that such a policy move by the United States would be shameful. How Poland responds is not going to be easy. I think that Radek Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, is skilled enough to find the best way forward that would compromise neither Poland's principles nor its interests. But that's an ugly choice to have to make.
Mr. Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland, thank you very much for your time, as always.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all for World News tonight. But don't go anywhere. On the Record is next as Adam Yasser speaks exclusively to Sir Robin Niblett. I'm Aaron Dahmen. Good night.